The box was taped shut with packing tape gone yellow at the edges, shoved behind the water heater in a corner of the basement I hadn't cleaned out in 3 years, and the first thing I noticed, before I even opened it, was that my wife's handwriting on the side said nothing. No label. Every other box in that basement had a label. Christmas, Emma's baby clothes, taxes 2019, in Melissa's neat, looping print. This one just said nothing, and that absence was the first thing that made my hands go still. My name is Ethan. I'm 34. I teach high school chemistry 2 miles from the house I grew up in, and 6 years ago I married a woman I believed I knew completely. Every scar, every embarrassing story, every ex-boyfriend she'd ever mentioned in passing over wine. I was wrong about the last part, though I wouldn't understand how wrong for another several weeks. I'd gone down to the basement that Saturday afternoon in September looking for a box of old textbooks I wanted to donate to my classroom. Our 4-year-old daughter Emma was napping upstairs, and Melissa was in Indianapolis for a 2-day hospital administrators conference, the kind of trip she took 3 or 4 times a year without much fanfare. It should have been an unremarkable errand. 20 minutes in a basement that smelled like laundry detergent and old cardboard. In and out. Back upstairs before Emma woke up cranky and disoriented the way she always did from naps. Instead, I found a box that didn't match any inventory I carried in my head, sitting in a spot I would have sworn was empty the last time I'd been down there for the holiday decorations, half hidden behind the water heater like someone had wanted it out of casual sight, but hadn't wanted to leave the house to hide it properly. I told myself it was probably old paperwork, insurance documents, maybe, or something from her late father's estate that she hadn't wanted cluttering the filing cabinet upstairs. I told myself a lot of things, standing there in the dim yellow light of that basement, before I finally worked my thumbnail under the tape. The basement had that particular quiet houses get in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. The hum of the water heater, a floorboard settling somewhere above me, Emma's white noise machine bleeding faintly through the ceiling vent. I remember the tape resisting, then giving all at once with a sound like a small tear, and the smell that came up from the cardboard, dust, and underneath it, something floral and old, like a perfume that had faded into the fibers of paper over a very long time. Inside, photographs. A stack of them, maybe 40, printed the old way from a drugstore kiosk with the date stamped in orange in the corner, the kind of printing nobody's done in over a decade. I lifted the top one into the light. It showed a much younger Melissa. College age, her hair long and center-parted in a way she hadn't worn it in all 6 years I'd known her, standing on a dock somewhere, laughing at whoever held the camera, her arm looped through the arm of a tall man with sandy hair and a build like he'd played some kind of sport in high school and kept at it loosely into his 20s. I didn't recognize him. I flipped to the next photo. Same man, different setting, a tailgate, red cups on a folding table, a stadium in the background. The next, the two of them at what was unmistakably a graduation, gowns and caps, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his chest in the easy, unconscious way people touch someone they've touched 1,000 times before. I sat down on the concrete floor without quite deciding to. Not because an ex-boyfriend was, in itself, shocking. Melissa had mentioned dating in college, vaguely, the way most people do when the subject comes up at a dinner party. Nothing serious, a couple of guys, nobody worth talking about. That's almost verbatim what she'd told me, early on, when I'd asked the standard question everyone asks in the first year of a relationship. It was the volume of what was in front of me now that didn't square with nobody worth talking about. 40 photographs. Underneath them, when I set the stack aside, a bundle of letters. Actual letters, folded into thirds, the paper gone soft at the creases, in handwriting that wasn't hers, addressed simply to Mel. I fanned through them without fully unfolding any single one, some instinct telling me that reading the words themselves was a line I wasn't ready to cross yet, and counted at least 20, maybe more. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the letters, a dried corsage. Carnations gone the color of old paper, ribbon faded to a dull gray blue, still pinned to a folded index card. On the card, in her handwriting, unmistakably hers, for words, Ryan. Homecoming, junior year. I sat there a long time. Long enough that my legs went stiff against the concrete. Long enough that the water heater cycled on and off once beside me, loud in the silence. I did the math without meaning to. Homecoming, junior year, graduation photos, a relationship substantial enough to generate this much physical residue. 3 years, at minimum, based on the handful of dates scrawled in the corners of the older photographs. Not a fling. Not nobody worth talking about. A relationship that had shaped a meaningful chunk of her early 20s. One she had never once described to me by name in 6 years of marriage and 4 years of dating before that. I put everything back exactly as I remembered finding it. Photographs on top, letters beneath, the corsage tucked at the bottom, the flap folded the way it had been folded before, though the tape wouldn't quite hold the same way twice, and I ended up pressing a strip of packing tape from my own toolbox over the seam, hoping she wouldn't notice the difference. I carried the box back to its spot behind the water heater, angled the way I'd found it, and stood there for a moment feeling like I'd disturbed something that was supposed to stay undisturbed. Not just the cardboard, but some quieter architecture underneath our marriage that I hadn't known was load-bearing until I'd put my hand against it. Upstairs, Emma was awake, calling for me in the particular froggy voice she got right after a nap, and I went to her without having decided anything, without a plan, carrying whatever I'd just found up the stairs with me like something heavy and formless I didn't yet have a shape for. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house had gone quiet in the way houses do once a small child stops generating noise in it, I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, a habit I didn't consciously notice in myself yet, though it would become familiar over the following weeks, and felt something pressing against the inside of my chest that I couldn't name. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to vertigo, the sense of having walked into a room in my own house that I hadn't known existed. I didn't call Melissa that night to ask about it. I told myself I needed to think about how to bring something like this up without sounding like I'd been snooping through her belongings. Even though, strictly speaking, I had been, if only by accident, looking for chemistry textbooks in my own basement. I told myself there was probably an ordinary explanation. Everyone keeps some box of old memories somewhere, don't they? I had one myself, technically, from a relationship in my early 20s with a woman named Amanda, sitting in a bin in our garage. The difference, some small and stubbornly honest part of me kept insisting even as I tried to talk myself out of it, was that Melissa knew Amanda existed. I'd mentioned her, once, early on, a 2-year relationship in college that ended when Amanda moved to Seattle for a job. Melissa had never once, in 10 years of knowing her, said the name Ryan out loud in my presence. I went to bed that night before she called to say goodnight from her hotel room. And when my phone lit up with her name on the screen, I let it ring twice before I answered, listening to her voice, warm, familiar, unchanged, describing a mediocre conference dinner and a coworker's terrible hotel room Wi-Fi, and thinking the entire time about a dried corsage at the bottom of a box with no label. For words in her handwriting that told me more about who she used to be than anything she'd told me directly in 10 years together. I didn't say anything to her that night. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, the right words, a version of this conversation that wouldn't come out sounding like an accusation. I didn't know it yet, but the box wasn't going to stay a secret between just the two of us much longer. And when it came out into the open, it wouldn't be me who brought it there. For the first week after finding the box, life went on with a normalcy that felt almost aggressive in its ordinariness. Melissa came home from Indianapolis on a Sunday evening, tired and slightly sunburned from a conference happy hour held on a rooftop patio, and kissed me hello in the kitchen while Emma clung to her leg demanding to be picked up. We ate leftover lasagna. She told me a long, funny story about a coworker who'd locked himself out of his hotel room in a bathrobe. I laughed in the right places. Nothing about the evening suggested that 12 feet below us, behind a water heater, sat a box that had rearranged something in how I understood the last decade of her life. I watched her differently in the days that followed, not with suspicion exactly. That word implies I'd already decided something had happened, and I hadn't, not yet, but with a kind of quiet, unwanted attentiveness, the way you notice a house differently after learning it was built on a floodplain. She caught me looking at her one night over Emma's macaroni and cheese, my fork halfway to my mouth, my eyes lingering a beat too long on her face like I was trying to read something written in a language I used to know better. "What?" she said, not unkindly, just curious. "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking you look nice tonight." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the truth either, and I want to be honest about that. because I spent the next several weeks quietly building a case in my head about what Melissa was and wasn't telling me, all while withholding, myself, the fact that I'd found the box at all. I've thought about that imbalance a lot since. At the time, it felt justified. I was gathering information, being careful, not wanting to blow up a marriage over what might turn out to be nothing. Looking back, I understand it differently. I wasn't protecting the marriage. I was protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to control the outcome of. And calling that caution let me avoid calling it what it actually was, which was fear. The real disruption arrived 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early October, at Emma's 4th birthday party in our own backyard. We'd invited 11 families from her preschool and our street, strung paper lanterns between the maple trees, and rented a bounce house that had arrived that morning smelling aggressively of new vinyl. I was at the folding table refilling the drink cooler with ice when I heard Melissa's voice change behind me. Not panicked, not raised, just tightened in a way I recognized from the handful of real arguments we'd had over 6 years of marriage, a register she almost never used with strangers. I turned around. A man was standing near the side gate that led from our driveway into the backyard, having let himself in without knocking, tall and sandy-haired, heavier through the shoulders than the photographs in the basement, but unmistakably, immediately, the same man. He wore sunglasses he didn't take off even under the shade of the maple tree, and he was smiling at Melissa in a way that assumed a familiarity our other guests didn't have. "Ryan," Melissa said, and her voice had a brightness in it that didn't match the rest of her face. "What are you doing here?" He said something about being in the neighborhood, about seeing balloons tied to our mailbox from the street, and wanting to say hi, though our house sits on a dead-end street that nobody drives down by accident, which meant he'd either come looking for this specific address on purpose or he already knew exactly where we lived. I stood there holding a half-empty bag of ice, watching my wife's face perform a kind of controlled calm I'd never seen from her before, smiling at the other parents nearby, while her eyes kept flicking toward this man like she was calculating the fastest route to an ending. I walked over and introduced myself, because that's what you do, because 11 other families were watching this exchange with the specific interest people reserve for anything that smells faintly like drama at a children's party. He shook my hand with a grip that lingered half a second too long and said, "Good to finally meet you, man," in a tone that implied he already had context for who I was, which meant Melissa had talked about me to him at some point, which meant whatever this was, it wasn't a stranger surfacing after a decade of silence. It was someone with a working knowledge of my wife's current life. He stayed maybe 4 minutes, made a joke about the bounce house that landed flat, and left the way he'd come, through the side gate, without saying goodbye to Melissa directly, just a small nod in her direction that she didn't quite return. She spent the rest of the party laughing a half-second too loud at things that weren't especially funny, refilling drink cups that didn't need refilling, moving through the yard with the specific busyness of someone trying to outrun a conversation she knew was coming. I noticed it. I filed it away with everything else I was filing away that fall, a growing private ledger I hadn't admitted to keeping. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep still wearing one sock from her birthday pajamas, I asked Melissa, as casually as I could manage while rinsing a stack of paper plates, who that was. "Old friend from college," she said, not looking up from the dishwasher she was loading. "Ryan. I haven't seen him in, God, it's been years. Weird that he just showed up like that, out of nowhere." She said old friend, not old boyfriend. I noticed the word choice the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you've heard 100 times, small, almost forgivable on its own, and completely impossible to unhear once you've caught it. I didn't mention the box. I told myself, again, that I was waiting for the right moment. I understand now that there was no version of that moment that wouldn't have felt difficult, and that what I was actually doing was postponing a reckoning I sensed, correctly, would not stay small once I started it. Over the following weeks, small inconsistencies began surfacing the way sediment rises in water you'd thought was still. Melissa's phone, which had sat face up on our kitchen counter for the entirety of our 6-year marriage, started appearing face down, screen against the granite. When I mentioned it, lightly, one evening, she said she'd read an article about blue light and sleep quality and had started making a habit of it. It was a specific, oddly thorough explanation for something so small, and its specificity did more to unsettle me than a shrug would have. She began taking phone calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. Work stuff, she said. Hospital administration apparently requiring a new and sudden degree of privacy it had never seemed to need in the previous 5 years of her career. I stood in the kitchen once, half listening through the door that connected to the garage, and heard the low murmur of her voice without being able to make out words, and felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't examine closely, because examining it closely felt like a door I wasn't ready to open. The clearest sign came from Emma, delivered the way small children deliver information, without any understanding of its weight, folded casually into an unrelated sentence at the dinner table. "Mommy's friend Ryan picked me up from Miss Carroll's," she announced, apropos of nothing, poking at a piece of broccoli. "He has a red car." Melissa's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. I watched her recover in under 2 seconds, smooth, practiced, the kind of quick correction that comes from having anticipated the possibility of this exact conversation. "Oh, right," she said, to Emma, then to me, without missing a beat. "I meant to mention that. I got stuck on a call at work last Tuesday, and Ryan happened to be nearby, so he grabbed her from daycare and walked her the 2 blocks home. It was completely last minute. I should have texted you." I said nothing in the moment. I asked Emma about her day instead, about what she and Miss Carroll had done at circle time, because it was easier than asking the question sitting directly behind my teeth. Since when did a man I'd met exactly once, for 4 minutes, at our daughter's birthday party, have a standing enough presence in Melissa's life to be trusted with picking up our child? That detail sat with me for days in a way the phone and the garage calls hadn't quite managed to. A friend from a decade ago doesn't casually end up on an approved pickup list at a 4-year-old's daycare unless there's been considerably more contact than a chance run-in at a birthday party. I started, quietly, and with a growing discomfort at my own behavior, checking things I'd never had reason to check before. Our joint credit card statement, pulled up online one night after Melissa had gone to bed, showed 2 separate charges at a place called the Cornerstone Cafe, a lunch spot downtown, nowhere near the hospital, both on days she'd told me she'd eaten at her desk through a packed schedule. I sat with the laptop glowing in the dark of our living room and told myself there could be an explanation. A coworker's going away lunch. A client meeting that ran over. I told myself a lot of things that week, the same way I'd told myself things in the basement a month earlier, and each explanation held for slightly less time than the one before it. 3 nights later, her phone lit up on the counter while she was in the shower, face up for once, and I saw it before I could stop myself from seeing it. A text preview. Just a single letter for the contact name, R, and 3 words beneath it. Missed this already. I didn't say anything to her that night either. I stood in the kitchen with the water running upstairs and felt the last of my ordinary explanations quietly give way, one by one. The way ice gives way, not all at once, but in a series of small, specific cracks that you don't fully register as dangerous until you're already standing on water. I didn't know it yet. But the box in the basement wasn't the secret that was going to end things. It was only the first thread, and pulling on it, when I finally worked up the nerve, was going to unravel something I hadn't even known was there to unravel. I called my sister Kate on a Tuesday night in late October, ostensibly to ask about a recipe for the fall potluck at school, but really because I didn't know what else to do with what I was carrying. Kate is 4 years older than me, married with teenagers of her own, and has never in her life let me get away with avoiding a direct question. "Have you actually asked Melissa about any of this?" she said, after I'd laid it out. The box, the man at the party, the phone turned face down. Not hinted, not tiptoed around it. Asked. I admitted I hadn't. "Ethan." She said my name the way she used to when I was 17 and about to make a decision she could already see the end of. "You found a box of evidence of an entire relationship she never told you about. And your plan is to just watch her? For how long?" I didn't have a good answer. I told her I didn't want to blow anything up over what might turn out to be nothing. And she was quiet for a second before she said something that stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. "You're not protecting the marriage by staying quiet. You're protecting yourself from finding out something you're scared of." I laughed it off at the time, said she was overanalyzing, and got off the phone feeling worse than when I dialed. Looking back, that was the moment I should have listened to the person seeing this most clearly from outside it. I didn't. Not yet. The following week, Emma handed me the next piece without knowing what she was handing me, the way she'd handed me the last one. Is Ryan going to come to my school Thanksgiving thing? She asked, coloring at the kitchen table while I made dinner. Mommy said maybe. I set down the wooden spoon I was holding. Mommy said that. She said we'll see. Emma went back to her coloring, entirely unbothered. A 4-year-old handing her father a live wire without any sense of its charge. I asked Melissa about it that night, after Emma was in bed, trying to keep my voice light in a way that felt increasingly difficult to manufacture. Emma mentioned something about Ryan coming to her Thanksgiving program at school. Something crossed Melissa's face, quick, there and gone. A flicker I might have missed if I hadn't been watching for exactly this kind of thing for over a month now. She must have misunderstood something. I think I said something like, maybe some of my friends will come see your school stuff sometime. General, you know how she takes things literally. It was a plausible explanation. It was also the third time in 5 weeks that a plausible explanation had arrived slightly too fast, slightly too smooth, like a door already oiled for exactly this kind of question. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever watched someone you love construct an explanation in real time, not lying exactly, not yet, but choosing words with a precision that tells you they've rehearsed this moment in their head before you ever asked. You know the specific kind of loneliness that comes with realizing you're no longer sure which version of a person you're actually married to. I went back to the basement twice that November, not to look for anything new. I told myself that both times, and both times it was a lie I was telling myself, because I went straight to the water heater and lifted the flap of the box to see if anything had changed. The second time it had. The stack of photographs was in a slightly different order than I remembered leaving it. Not dramatically, but enough that a chemistry teacher who spends his professional life training himself to notice small variances in controlled conditions could tell the difference. Someone had been in this box since I'd last closed it. Given that I hadn't touched it, that left exactly one person. That detail sat wrong with me for days. If she'd gone back into the box herself, it meant she knew, or suspected, that something about it mattered right now. Which meant whatever this was with Ryan wasn't a dead relic she'd simply forgotten to throw away. It was something she was actively managing. I found the receipt in mid-November, tucked into the pocket of a coat she almost never wore, a wool peacoat reserved for the coldest days, the kind of coat you don't check the pockets of until winter actually arrives and you're pulling it out of storage for the first time. A restaurant 35 minutes outside Bloomington, a town called Nashville, Indiana, known mostly for its antique shops and covered bridges. Not anywhere Melissa had ever mentioned going. Not anywhere on her usual radius between home, the hospital, and Emma's daycare. The receipt was dated the previous Thursday, a day she'd told me she was staying late at the hospital for a budget meeting. 2 entrees. 1 check. I stood in our bedroom holding that receipt for a long time, feeling something in my chest that had moved past the vague unease of the last month into something sharper, more specific, closer to grief, though grief for what exactly I still couldn't have said out loud. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself, again, that I needed more, a phrase I'd been using with myself for 6 weeks now, though what more would actually look like, or when I'd know I had enough of it, I couldn't have told you. The truth, which took me longer than it should have to admit, was that some part of me was terrified that once I said the words out loud, there would be no version of my life afterward that looked like the one I currently had, however uncertain and eroding it had become. Staying quiet let me keep living inside the last shape of my marriage a little longer, even while I suspected that shape no longer matched what was actually happening underneath it. She told me, much later, what those weeks had actually looked like from her side of things, after everything else had already come apart, in a conversation neither of us planned to have the way it happened. This is what she said. I told myself I could handle it. That's the thing nobody tells you about a mistake like this. You don't decide to keep making it. You just keep telling yourself, one more time, that this is the last time, and you almost believe it, because believing it is the only way to get through the next hour. Ryan reached out that September, out of nowhere, a message about a mutual friend's wedding neither of us could attend, and I told myself answering one message wasn't the same as anything. Then it was 2 messages. Then it was lunch, which I told myself was closure. Catching up, nothing that meant anything. I remember sitting in that restaurant in Nashville watching him talk with his hands the exact same way he had in college, and feeling something in me that I hadn't felt reach for in years. Not for him specifically, I don't think, but for the version of myself I used to be around him, before I became someone's wife and someone's mother and stopped being anyone's first choice for anything. I told myself I could keep this contained. I was already wrong by the time I told myself that. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Sitting across from her at our own dinner table that November, watching her pass Emma more green beans, entirely unaware of how much ground had already shifted beneath us. Thanksgiving arrived, and Ryan did not come to Emma's school program, which should have reassured me and somehow didn't. It felt less like an absence of a threat and more like a threat being carefully managed out of my line of sight. Melissa's mother, visiting for the holiday from Fort Wayne, mentioned once, offhandedly, over pie, that she'd run into that Ryan fellow at the grocery store back home over the summer. And hadn't Melissa mentioned they'd reconnected at a mutual friends thing? Melissa changed the subject so fast and so smoothly that her mother didn't seem to notice anything odd about it. I did. It meant this had been going on since at least summer. Months longer than I'd assumed, months before I'd even found the box. By early December, I had stopped being able to convince myself that what I was watching was nothing. I still hadn't said a single word to Melissa about any of it. Not the box, not the receipt, not the reordered photographs, not the text that had flashed across her phone screen weeks earlier. I had, instead, become a quiet and increasingly thorough archivist of my own marriage's unraveling, cataloging evidence with the same careful attention I brought to grading lab reports, while doing absolutely nothing with what I'd gathered. I told myself, more than once that December, that I was protecting Emma, protecting the holidays, protecting some fragile normalcy I wasn't ready to shatter over what I still, on my worst nights, hoped might be an innocent misunderstanding I'd blown out of proportion. I know now that I wasn't protecting anything except my own ability to postpone a conversation I sensed, correctly, was going to end badly no matter how carefully I timed it. I didn't know it yet, but the conversation I kept avoiding wasn't going to wait for me to feel ready. It was going to arrive on its own schedule, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, in a form I never once considered, and when it did, everything I thought I'd carefully pieced together would turn out to be only half the story. December moved fast once I stopped pretending I wasn't looking for something. I checked our bank statements more carefully now, going back further than the 2 Cornerstone Cafe charges I'd already found. There were others, smaller, easier to miss, spread out enough that no single month looked alarming on its own. A gas station in Nashville, Indiana. A coffee shop I didn't recognize, charged twice in November. None of it was reckless. It was the spending pattern of someone being careful, which somehow unsettled me more than carelessness would have. I found Ryan's full name, Ryan Hastings, printed on an insurance renewal notice for a car, forwarded to our address by mistake. A clerical error from some old shared account neither of us had thought to correct. It sat in our mail pile for 3 days before I even registered what I was looking at. A quick search told me he lived 2 towns over, worked in commercial real estate, and had, based on a public event listing, attended the same hospital charity gala Melissa had gone to in October, the one she described to me afterward as boring, mostly old donors. I left early. I didn't confront her. I told myself I still needed to understand the full shape of it before I said anything. Though by this point I recognized that understanding the full shape of it had become a kind of permanent holding pattern, a way of feeling active while doing nothing that would actually change anything. The clearest piece of proof came the week before Christmas, almost by accident. Melissa had asked me to grab her laptop charger from her work bag for an early meeting, and in doing so I found, tucked in a zippered inside pocket, a hotel key card sleeve from a Marriott in Indianapolis, dated to a weekend 2 weeks earlier, a weekend she'd told me was another conference. The sleeve had 2 names printed faintly on it under the room number. Hers, and a name I now recognized instantly. I sat on the edge of our bed holding that little paper sleeve for what felt like a long time. Somewhere in the house, Emma was asking Melissa a question about her shoes and the ordinariness of that sound. A 4-year-old worrying about mismatched socks, while I held physical proof that the last several months of my marriage had been a performance, was its own particular kind of disorientation. That detail seemed, in the moment, like the end of the investigation. It wasn't. It was only the piece that finally gave me enough certainty to stop gathering and start deciding what to do with what I had. I called Kate again that night, from my car in the school parking lot after everyone else had gone home, and told her everything. She didn't say "I told you so," though she would have been within her rights to. She just asked, quietly, What do you want to do with it? I didn't have an answer yet. I told her I needed a few more days. Those few days were the strangest of the entire ordeal. Moving through our normal holiday routines, decorating a tree with Emma, wrapping presents, attending my school's staff party, all while carrying a hotel key sleeve folded into an envelope in my sock drawer like something radioactive. Melissa seemed, if anything, more affectionate than usual that week, which I understand now, in hindsight, as the particular guilt-driven overcorrection of someone trying to convince herself the ground beneath her wasn't shifting. If I had confronted her the night I found that key sleeve instead of waiting 9 more days, gathering myself, rehearsing words I never ended up using, some of what followed might have gone differently. It didn't happen that way. By the time I finally sat her down, 2 days after New Year's, I had a folder, the receipts, the bank statements, the hotel sleeve, even the box from the basement, which I'd quietly retrieved and brought upstairs without telling her. I didn't know it yet, but everything in that folder, everything I'd spent 4 months carefully assembling, was about to become almost beside the point the moment she actually started talking. I sat her down at the kitchen table 2 days after New Year's, once Emma was asleep, and put the folder in front of her without opening it. I need you to just talk to me, I said. Whatever it is. All of it. She looked at the folder for a long moment, then at me, and something in her face shifted, not panic exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door to finally open. I want to be honest, I didn't start strong. I started by trying to explain it away before she'd said a single word. Maybe it's not what it looks like, I heard myself say. Maybe you were just processing something from your past. Maybe I'm reading too much into a receipt and a hotel key. Maybe. Ethan. She said my name quietly, cutting through it. Stop. Let me talk. I stopped. Yes, she said. It's Ryan. It's been Ryan since September. I'm not going to sit here and make you work for that answer. She paused, and I remember thinking, in that half second, that I finally had what I'd spent 4 months assembling. Confirmation, the end of the investigation. I was wrong about what would happen next. But that's not actually the thing I need to tell you, she said. The affair isn't the worst part of this, Ethan. I need you to hear the rest before you decide anything. I sat very still. Ryan and I were never really over, she said. Not the way I told you. We dated for 3 years in college. That part's true. That part you saw in that box. What I never told you is that we got married. Quietly, at the courthouse, the summer before senior year, 22 years old and stupid, and certain we knew what we were doing. It lasted 4 months before we both realized we weren't ready for any of it, and we filed for an annulment that fall. I never told anyone. Not my mother, not my friends, not you. As far as the world was concerned, it never happened. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still at the same time. When you and I met, 3 years later, she went on, I told myself it didn't matter. An annulment means it's like it never happened, legally. That's what I told myself, over and over, every time I almost said something and didn't. I told you about dating in college because I had to say something, and I made it small on purpose. I made him small on purpose. And then I married you. And I built an entire life around a version of my past that I'd edited down to something I could live with. She stopped, and I could see her deciding whether to keep going. And then she did. And once she started, I understood I wasn't going to be able to interrupt this even if I'd wanted to. You want to know how it actually started again, this time? It wasn't dramatic. He messaged me in September about a mutual friend's wedding, something small and ordinary, and I told myself answering was harmless because we'd already been married and divorced once. What was one message between people who already knew everything about each other? That's the lie I told myself, the very first one. That because we'd already crossed every line there was to cross, once, a long time ago, it didn't count as crossing a new one now. Then it was coffee. Then it was the gala in October, and I told you I left early because it was boring, and that was true. Except I left with him, not alone, and we sat in his car in the parking garage for an hour talking about nothing and everything, and I felt 19 again in a way I hadn't let myself feel in a decade. I told myself that 1 hour in a parking garage wasn't the same as an affair. I got very good, this fall, at telling myself things weren't the same as other things. By the time it became what you found on that hotel key, I'd stopped being able to tell myself anything at all. I knew exactly what it was. I kept going anyway, because stopping meant admitting what I'd become, and some part of me decided that was worse than the guilt. I couldn't look at Emma's drawings on the fridge those weeks, Ethan. I want you to know that. I'd come home and see them taped up there and have to look away, because looking at them straight on meant looking at what I was risking. I tried to end it in November. I told him it had to stop, and I meant it, for about 9 days. Then he texted me something small, and I answered, and I was right back in it. And I hated myself more each time it got easier to go back than to stay away. I'm not telling you this to make it smaller. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the whole shape of it, not just the piece you found in a box in the basement. You weren't married to the woman you thought you were. You were married to someone who'd already failed at this once, quietly, and spent a decade pretending that failure didn't exist. The kitchen was very quiet after that. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, and I understand now that what I was doing, what I'd been doing all evening, really, all month, was searching for a version of this that made sense to me, reframing every year of our marriage in light of what she'd just said, looking for the exact moment the woman I married had stopped being real and become, instead, a carefully maintained story. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just kept turning it over, out loud, half to her and half to myself, asking whether Emma's birth had actually lined up the way I remembered, whether the old friend from college line had been rehearsed years before she ever used it on me, searching for logic in a situation that didn't have any left to give me. Ethan, she said, finally quietly. Say something. I don't know what you want me to say, I said. I don't know what's true anymore. I don't know which parts of the last 10 years actually happened the way I thought they did. I didn't leave that night. I didn't throw anything, didn't raise my voice. I went into the bathroom and turned on the tap and stood there staring at the water running into the sink for a long time. The way you do when you need your body to be doing something ordinary while everything else stops making sense. When I came back out, she was still sitting at the table exactly where I'd left her, and neither of us said anything else that night. We went to bed in the same house, in different rooms, further from each other than we had ever been. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. There wasn't a dramatic final scene to it. No second confrontation, no screaming match to close out what the first conversation had opened. Just a long, quiet stretch of January where I moved into my sister Kate's guest room, came back to see Emma every other day, and sat with a version of my marriage I no longer recognized as something that had ever fully existed the way I'd believed it did. Melissa didn't fight the divorce. I think some part of her had been waiting for it since the day I set that folder on the kitchen table. Maybe since the day she went back into that box in the basement and reordered the photographs. Some private ritual of a woman quietly saying goodbye to a version of her past she'd finally run out of room to keep separate from her present. The consequences landed on her in ways I hadn't engineered and didn't need to. Ryan didn't leave his own marriage for her. I learned, secondhand, through the same small-town network that eventually tells everyone everything, that he'd never planned to. Within 2 months of the truth coming out, he'd quietly ended things with Melissa entirely, telling a mutual acquaintance that things had gotten complicated. The same phrase, I imagine, he'd probably used once before, 12 years earlier, right before their annulment. Whatever Melissa had risked everything to reach for, it evaporated almost as fast as it had reappeared. The custody arrangement gave me more time with Emma than I'd expected to ask for. The judge, hearing the details of Melissa's absences over the previous fall, wasn't unsympathetic to Melissa, but wasn't inclined to question my stability either. I kept the house. Melissa moved into an apartment across town and started, as far as I know, largely rebuilding her life alone. The friend group that had once revolved partly around dinners at our place quietly redistributed itself in my direction, not out of loyalty exactly, just the ordinary gravity of who'd been more visibly wronged. I think about the box more than I expected to, a year later. Not with anger anymore, mostly. More with a kind of clarity about what it actually represented once I understood the whole shape of it. It was never really about Ryan, in the end, not the affair, not even the annulment. It was about a woman who'd made one significant mistake at 22 and decided, quietly, permanently, that hiding it was safer than living with the truth of it. I think about how much of our marriage was built on that decision without my ever knowing it was there. A foundation I trusted completely, poured over a crack she'd sealed up years before I ever arrived. I don't know if things would have gone differently if she'd told me about the annulment honestly, early on, in our first year together. I'd like to think I could have handled it. I'll never actually know, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is this. I stopped sleeping badly sometime around March, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep I hadn't had since September. I started running again in the mornings, something I'd let go of years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with how much of myself I'd quietly deprioritized without noticing. I taught my chemistry classes that spring with something close to genuine energy again. The fog I'd been moving through since October, finally lifting in increments I only noticed in hindsight. Emma asked me once, that summer, why Mommy and I didn't live in the same house anymore. I told her the truth in the smallest, gentlest version I could manage. That sometimes grown-ups make choices that mean they can't be married anymore. But that both of us loved her exactly the same, in two houses instead of one. She considered this with the particular seriousness 4-year-olds bring to enormous questions, then asked if she could still have pancakes at both houses. I told her yes. She seemed satisfied with that answer in a way I found, standing in my kitchen that morning, unexpectedly moving. I didn't announce any of this to anyone. Not the sleeping better, not the running, not the sense, arriving quietly sometime that spring, that I'd become steadier than the man who'd sat frozen in that basement the previous September. I just noticed, one ordinary Tuesday morning, making coffee before Emma woke up, that the weight I'd been carrying, without fully registering it as weight, had simply stopped being there. I was fine. Genuinely, finally, fine. Not because anything had been resolved with fanfare, but because I'd stopped waiting for an explanation that would make the last year make sense and started building something new instead, on ground I finally understood the shape of. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing the person you loved most completely was never fully known to you. Not because she was cruel, but because she decided, at 22, that some truths cost more to tell than to bury. I think about the reordered photographs in that basement box more than almost anything else from that year, because that small detail, noticing they'd been touched, was the moment I understood, without yet having proof, that whatever this was, it was alive, not archived. I ignored that signal for weeks anyway. The way I ignored the face-down phone and the too-quick explanation about Ryan picking up Emma from daycare, because each individual flag felt too small to justify the conversation I sensed waiting behind it. What I understand now, looking back, is that I mistook my own patience for wisdom. I told myself I was gathering proof responsibly, being careful not to accuse without certainty, when really I was avoiding a conversation I was afraid would cost me the life I already had, however hollow it had quietly become. Denial, I've learned, isn't weakness. It's a decision you make because the alternative feels more expensive than you're ready to pay, until the bill arrives anyway, on its own schedule, whether you're ready or not. The deeper truth this whole year revealed to me is that Melissa's real betrayal was never really about Ryan showing up at a birthday party, or a hotel key card, or even the affair itself. It was a decade-long act of editing, deciding, once, that a piece of her past was too costly to include in the stories she gave me, and then spending 10 years maintaining that omission as if it were simply the truth. I've had to sit with the possibility that anyone builds a version of their history for the people they love, leaving out the parts that feel too heavy to carry into a new life. Most of those omissions probably never surface. Hers did, and when it did, it took the whole structure down with it. Not because one marriage at 22 was unforgivable, but because a decade of silence about it meant I'd never actually been given the chance to decide, myself, whether it was.